Hello, my name is Glessie Reese, and I will be talking about heritage language learners in a foreign language classroom. Among the many challenges that foreign language teachers encounter on a daily basis, a developing concern is how to best help heritage language learners in the foreign language classroom. A heritage language learner is most basically defined as a bilingual in English and a home language other than English with varying degrees of proficiency in the home language. With an ever-growing Hispanic population in the United States and a requirement of second language learning in secondary education, heritage language learners are becoming a more common presence in the foreign language classroom. This study used the action research process to delve into the world of heritage language learning to help a diverse population of heritage language learners in a Department of Defense middle high school in Germany. Currently, there are 83 students taking Spanish 1, 2, 3, or 4, and within this population there are quite a few heritage language learners. As previously stated, the needs of these students' language development are diverse. Many can speak fluently, while literacy skills are underdeveloped. Others, however, have an oral understanding of Spanish, while both literacy and fluency are in need of improvement. Among these needs are also needs related to special concerns or social concerns for these students. These and other topics regarding this diverse population and their diverse needs will be further discussed during this presentation. However, this topic still needs to be explored both for the current population in Germany and throughout the world because in general it's not a highly explored topic. This action research study will apply various strategies that have been researched and various ideas I've come up with on my own to help heritage language learners become more engaged in the classroom while also helping them to further their language skills. The definition of a heritage language learner is not a concrete definition that can identify the skills of these students and their specific needs, but instead is a term that identifies a spectrum of needs and even a variety of different students. In fact, the term has been long discussed in the past and continues to be a debate today, using words such as native speakers, quasi-native speakers, residual speakers, bilingual speakers, and home background speakers. Heritage language learners of the Spanish language have several social, motivational, and content needs when formally learning the Spanish language. The first is attitude. These students may think that since they already know the language and can speak it, they may not know, while they know the language and can speak it, they do not need formal education to help them progress. Due to their various levels of fluency, they may not know in what areas their language skills could be developed. The attitude can cast a shadow on their whole language development to help them reach fluency and literacy. Also, another difficulty that heritage language learners may have is dealing with other students. According to Hancock, a researcher in this field, other students may resent the heritage speakers' native-like familiarity with oral language and the appearance that the Spanish speakers are studying a language they already know. While attitude is an issue that will hinder students, an issue that could possibly hinder both teachers and students are the various dialects of the Spanish language. Heritage language learners will not have a standard dialect, but instead will represent a variety of dialects from around the world. Teachers need to be sensitive to these dialects and the various facets of these students' language. Word choice will not always be the same, as well as with some aspects of grammar. If the teacher is insensitive to these varieties, he or she could quickly alienate these students in the classroom by essentially telling them that their dialect is wrong. Furthermore, students who already speak Spanish may have difficulty with teachers who are non-native speakers. This factor might cause students to think that since the teacher has learned the target language as a second language and does not speak the language natively, that any correction is due to a lack of proficiency on the teacher's part. Another researcher, Duran, brings in another social issue with heritage language learners in the foreign language classroom. She says that these students often feel ashamed that they are of Hispanic or Latino descent and they are most likely to carry on a colloquial conversation in Spanish at home or in the neighborhood in which they live. However, they're not necessarily able to write, read, or understand the grammatical concepts being presented to them in the traditional second language classroom setting. These various needs and social concerns and motivational concerns really can hinder these students in the classroom, and this is what this study really looks to help these students overcome. Some of the needs that these students have is discussing abstract ideas in the target language, in this case being Spanish. These students are more familiar with day-to-day conversations and basic Spanish language, but when talking about things in the abstract, it becomes more difficult for them to express their ideas fluently. Also, a major concern for these students is literacy, where most of the time they have spoken the language, not very often have they had an opportunity to write the language or read it. Also, just as with English, we have formal registers that we would use in academic settings versus informal registers that we would use when speaking with friends or family. Most of these students have strongly developed their informal register, but their formal register is underdeveloped and in many cases is non-existent. Also, specifically when it comes to writing, these students cannot hear things such as accents and spellings in the written language. For example, the C sound and the S sound in Spanish are the same, and so many people cannot hear the difference between a C and an S, and that becomes a problem and causes these students to misspell many things. Also, B, as in boy, and B are the same sound in Spanish, also causing problems with spelling. Accents are essential for Spanish because there are many words in Spanish that without an accent mean something different, and these students cannot hear the differences while they do know the meanings. Also, particularly in a class where you're trying to learn a second language, isolating specific grammar structures becomes difficult for these students because they don't do that when they're speaking. They don't always just speak in present tense, but will use a variety of tenses like present and future and past, all in the same utterance sometimes, and so isolating those can become difficult for those students. For strategies that I've used, I'll discuss those more in my results section. For a full listing of all the strategies that are out there, or most of the ones that I studied, that can be found in my paper. The methodology looked to answer 3 different questions. The first one was, what areas in foreign language are most difficult, and how do we help heritage language learners overcome these difficulties? What strategies motivate these learners to participate in and value foreign language class instead of being bored by something that they feel like they already know? And how can instruction be differentiated so we can simultaneously teach foreign language learners, heritage learners, and native speakers in the same classroom and course level so that all the needs are met? To answer all these questions, first students were given a questionnaire to identify the specific students who are in need of accommodations and differentiations as heritage language learners. The data was compared to a home language survey conducted by the middle high school. Once identified, these students were then evaluated individually for their specific needs and then compared with other heritage language learners to see what common trends there were of difficulties and how those could be addressed on a broader scale. From this point on, different strategies that I had learned through the literature review and personal ideas were used to help these students improve. After giving all these students the survey, 16 of 83 Spanish students were identified as heritage language learners. In this group, the influences were from many different dialects and countries, such as Puerto Rico, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Colombia. However, this information provided by students clashed with the information provided by the home language survey given by the school. This survey identified 9 of the 83 students as having a home where Spanish was the main language spoken. Based on this conflicting information, an interesting facet of the action research emerged. Students classified themselves as being heritage language learners based on many different influences. But let's see, as demonstrated by home language surveys, some students spoke Spanish as main language at home, and that was a constant part of their lives. There were 7 students that had varying degrees of Spanish abilities and influence at home. 4 of these students have parents who live at home and speak Spanish, but infrequently speak Spanish directly to the student, and only speak to other fluent speakers in their environment. These students, in particular, demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the Spanish language. They appear to be novice learners equal to traditional students in the classroom. One of these 7 students has a parent who speaks Spanish but does not live in the student's home. However, the student has demonstrated some familiarity with the Spanish in the classroom. The final student of 7 seems to have no familiarity with the Spanish language any more than any other traditional student. Spanish is not spoken in the home, and it's possible that this student has a grandparent who speaks Spanish, But this just goes to show that spectrum of needs that I was talking about at the beginning. As mentioned, the needs of these heritage language learners are varied, which is consistent with the current literature. Some of these specific needs that this action research project are spelling, specifically the confusion between the letters C, Z, and S, and V and B, and of course accents. The formal register used with academics and versus the informal register was a problem. The second person plural familiar conjugation form of vosotros in Spanish, which would be rendered y'all in English, was definitely a difficulty that will be discussed later, and also isolating specific grammar structure as well as motivational and social concerns. After identifying these challenge measures were taken to use some of the aforementioned, or some of the strategies that I learned through my research to help students overcome them. The following are stories and data based on the collection of this data. To focus on spelling and accents, since there's no oral indication or oral indication for these students, it was mostly motivation and explicitly pointing this out to students. I pulled one student aside at one point and she said that this really helped her. She felt like she had greater knowledge after really pointing each thing out. Accents were also taught explicitly with varying degrees of success. To help students learn formal versus informal register, have just a short story. One day in a class of 14 students, in which 3 of these students are heritage language learners, a discussion began based on a translation game. The sentence in English was, "I know how to speak Spanish." All of the heritage language learners wrote, "Yo sé cómo hablar español." The correct answer would have been, "Yo sé hablar español." Adding como, like I said in the first sentence, is an Anglicism, which refers to a grammatical structure that is influenced by English and not correctly rendered in Spanish, and is not grammatically correct, although frequent in spoken Spanish. If translated back to English, it'd be like saying, "I know how to speak Spanish." When the heritage language learners were told it was incorrect, they were not only shocked, but were defensive and said that I was incorrect. These situations are of course difficult, especially when the teacher is a non-native speaker like I am, because it sounds correct to the students. And many students will say it this way in informal settings. A student actually looked this up and she said everyone said it with como, "Yo sé cómo hablar español." The way that I handled this in the classroom was using a strategy from the literature review and calmly explaining the sociolinguistic implications of formal versus informal registers. When doing this, I referred to the governing body over the Spanish language that standardizes things that I had looked up, and just helped students to understand it, and help them to understand that while informally it would not be incorrect in the classroom, it would not be formal speech, and they seemed to accept that. And I really was careful to be sensitive to the sociolinguistic implications, and admitted that I myself would have used the informal in other situations, but never in an academic setting. The next thing is dialects. Again, we talked about many of the sociolinguistic perspectives. I said that typically I used an honest sociolinguistic perspective to communicate to students that they would probably never use some things in their dialect. For example, vosotros. Many of my students were from Central America, and vosotros is more, I think, from Spain. However, it will be used in literature and when in a formal classroom. And so when I helped students understand that it was valuable for them to learn, it seemed to be a good approach. Also, furthermore, with the moving on to the isolating specific grammar structures, there was one student that she was in Spanish 2, and she was unable to isolate verb conjugations in class, on homework assignments, and on quizzes. I had assumed early on that she had not acquired these verb conjugations, listening to her speak in different things in her home, but one day I was out in the community and I heard her speaking with her mother, and she was correctly using these verb conjugations. We had a one-on-one conference after school about this, And I asked her as she was working on a quiz how she would say things to her mother out loud, and many times she would come up with the right conjugation, although she could not isolate it. After accessing the student's knowledge in this manner, the student was able to put the language back in context, and the student's conjugations improved from that point. It seemed like the student removed any prior knowledge that she had had when she walked into the Spanish classroom, and so it took accessing the knowledge she acquired through different techniques versus just having it written on paper. I differentiated instruction by helping that student recognize how she would access that information, and inviting her to walk out of the classroom during quizzes to say these different things out loud so that she could access that knowledge. This method seemed to help her access this prior knowledge and be successful in the classroom. Finally, with social concerns, as there were many, I tried to really have compassion and empathy with these students, which was the main strategy in the research. And I also tried to create a community in the classroom that helped everyone feel like a learner. I set myself up as a learner so that students would know that I was learning the language too, and that I had many deficiencies, as well as their grammar and their language could be improved as well. Many times they would correct my pronunciation, or they would add in other words that they knew that I hadn't used for vocabulary for the rest of the class, and it was a really good environment to have that. I had one student who was particularly shy throughout the whole class, and many times became embarrassed when I would try to draw upon her knowledge, or she would refuse to add additional information. Near the end of my action research, the student volunteered, "I know another word for," and that was really exciting to see her finally participate in the class without being directly invited. Also, there was the notion that these students didn't have to work because they already knew the language, and I tried to help the traditional students understand that everyone was learning in the classroom, and that we were really focusing on different things for each one of them, helping them to know that these students may struggle with other things that they had to learn, such as accents or spelling or the formal register, just being very transparent about those things. For limitations, there were quite a few. I think the biggest one was probably time. This was a very short period of time, and this study, I think, could be done not just over months but over years to really figure out how to best help these students. Also, in hindsight, I think it would have been helpful to have a more concrete definition. If I would have structured that a little bit more, I think it would have helped to weed out some of the people who really could have been classified more as traditional students and not so much heritage language learners. I think also there's a spectrum always of abilities and intelligence and work ethics, for sure, of each of these students. Some of the students were very highly motivated and would work to do the best in the classroom, and others were okay with mediocre work, which I think you'll find in any classroom. In the future, I would definitely like to continue this study. I think one thing that I read in the research that is worth mentioning that was not possible to use during this study but would be interesting in the future is setting up a class specifically for Spanish for native speakers, so that these students are in a class where they're not studying Spanish as a second language but studying Spanish as their native language, just like we do in language arts classes or in English classes in the States, where they're using literature and reading to improve their literacy and to gain that formal academic register that they don't necessarily have when they learn the language at home. I think other things that would help is to help students set specific goals. I tried to do this a little bit but didn't carry through as much as I would like to. Helping students kind of take a look, maybe conference with them one-on-one where their Spanish is and where it could be, and help them set specific goals to move forward to that point. In general, however, I feel like this was a successful study. I've learned a lot, and I think that the students were able to progress in their language. and I thank you for listening to my presentation.